Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Chatham House session on the role of sanctions. My name is John Luff. I'm an associate fellow with the Russia and Eurasia program, and I'm delighted to have an expert panel with me today. We have three speakers. We have Maria Shagina, who is a visiting senior fellow at the Center on US Politics and Power at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. She works on currency statecraft and de-dollarization and has strong research interests in the area of economic statecraft and sanctions. We also have Tim Ash, known to many of us here in London as a veteran financial analyst who's worked in a number of financial institutions, currently is the senior sovereign strategist at Blu-ray Asset Management. And we also have joining us from the United States today, but normally based in London, Steve Mann, known to many probably at the session as somebody who held the post of a senior advisor at Exxon for a number of years, but prior to that had a distinguished career at the US State Department, and he was at one stage the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asian Affairs. So somebody very, very knowledgeable when it comes to our region. So I'm delighted to have our three panelists with us. A little bit of housekeeping just before we start. This event is held on the record, and a recording will be posted later on the Chatham House website and on YouTube. The speakers will speak for around 8 to 9 minutes each, so we will aim to get through their contributions in half an hour, and we will then have an hour available for questions and answers. Questions can be asked via the chat function, but you can also ask a question if you wish by, or at least you can alert my attention by raising your electronic hand, and I will then try to get to you. But since we have a very large number of people joining us today, we've had around 150 registrations, which is a large number for this sort of event. I can't give a guarantee I'm going to get to every single question. Maria, can we please start with you?
Thank you very much for the invitation, John. Happy to be here to talk on this important event and important date, I guess, as well. I'd like to make 3 points on this topic and start with comparing the current new sanctions with 2014. I think it's important to have it as a reference point where we are, how different it is from the situation back then and now. It's important to distinguish that now we're not talking about compellence. The current sanctions not aimed to coerce Russia to withdraw from the Donbas region. There is no conditionality as such. It's about deterrence, and that might be good news for those who craft sanctions. In sanctions literature, deterrence is much easier to achieve than to coerce Russia to withdraw once it's invaded Ukraine. The dynamics between the EU and US has improved. We see more coordination. The US is still in the driving seat. It's still prepared to go an extra mile than Europe is, but there is much more readiness on the side of the EU to impose sectoral sanctions. If we remember the situation around July 2014, there was a great reluctance on Germany's side in particular to trigger those sectoral sanctions. Now the appetite is there. There is even slight appetite to go into the energy sector. Potentially Russia's new gas projects can be sanctioned if Russia invades Ukraine. We hear constant discussion about swift, severe sanctions that will be triggered. So the readiness is much more there. The situation where it's slightly different is around Germany. Back then, Germany was the key country that coalesced the sanctions coalition, maintained them over a long time now. Today, we hear a lot of public criticism against Germany, and this has changed the dynamic, who is in the driving seat within the EU. Again, the dynamics within the EU is pretty much the same in terms of we still see the same tensions and divisions. The name of the countries might have changed, but we still hear that some countries are pushing for more sanctions, like Poland and the Baltic states, while Austria, Hungary are floated are those countries who are pulling for less sanctions. While the West is much more ready to impose sanctions, it's all about the equation. How ready is the West to impose hard-hitting sanctions, and where is Russia? The Russian appetite for geopolitical ambitions has not subsided, and also there is no element of surprise here. Russia is mentally and economically more prepared to weather the new sanctions. So the price for deterring Russia is much higher than it was in 2014, and that comes with the higher costs for the West to bear those. My second point is about strategy, Fortress Russia strategy, something that is constantly discussed, how Russia is prepared now versus 2014. And in comparison with the situation back then, on the macroeconomic level, the picture looks quite appealing. The economy is backed with ample international reserves, currently amounting to more than $640 billion, low sovereign debt and conservative fiscal policy. There is also less exposure in certain sectors. For example, the share of non-residents on the OFZ market dropped below 20%. There is also less international lending since 2014. Again, ample international reserves can be handy to bail out systemically important banks and companies. Russia's interconnectedness also works as a shield. Certain sanctions in the energy sector, but also the cutoff from SWIFT is not really on the table. Russia has also conducted a policy of de-dollarization and import substitution. There is certain progress that has been achieved here. In terms of import substitution, probably less impressive than some newspapers try to portray it. Low-tech items have been supplanted, but there's still a high reliance on Western high-tech software, but also hardware and semiconductors. In terms of de-dollarization, the progress has been better than in the area of import substitution. Russia did manage to reduce the share of the US dollar in its international reserves, but it's very much top-down driven de-dollarization. It has dropped to the level of 16% now versus 40% in 2014. In cross-border payments, it has also dropped, but this diversification was mainly shifted to the euro. So it's not the Russian ruble that the government wants to trust. In the long term, the economic growth will be sacrificed for the sake of this post-Soviet style stability. This strategy didn't aim to have excellent economic performance. It's about regime survival, so it's slightly different objective here. Sanctions in the long term will work as this persistent risk that will limit Russia's room for maneuver in terms of budget flexibility, in terms of investment prospects, and this will be a constant irritant and weigh-in terms of country risk for foreign investors. And my last point is about China. How much China can absorb the impact of the new sanctions. We obviously don't know what type of sanctions will be imposed, but it's important to see behavior of China in 2014. What has been done back then can tell us what China will be ready to do now. And back then, China was not really a panacea. It didn't extend a helping hand to all of the sanctions affected projects in Russia and also funding. China's private sector was often over-compliant with the Western sanctions. Chinese private sector either didn't know how sanctions were affecting them, or the ties to the US market were obviously much more important. So the only way to provide funding was basically via three main state-affiliated institutions, such as China Development Bank, Export-Import Bank of China, and also Silk Road Fund. So on this level, we can see the same level of help. If the US imposes export controls in the short term, China will not be able to help that much. There are some semiconductors perhaps that China can substitute, but of lower quality. But in the long term, we might be pushing Russia towards China in this area. China has quite big ambitions to onshore its semiconductor production, so we have to be careful how these sanctions options will be triggered. And finally, on SWIFT, since this is also a widely discussed area, China has also its own alternative, and it's usually floated something that can help Russia to do cross-border payments. But for the moment, SIPS also doesn't have this international outreach. It's very small in comparison with SWIFT, so there are limitations here. So we can say that China will definitely capitalize on Russia's isolation, but will be hardly a panacea to weather the new sanctions. I'll stop here.
Maria, thank you for those very clear and helpful opening remarks. I think you make a very important point at the outset that there is a difference between deterrence and compellence. And when we compare with 2014, it's not exactly the same situation. I'm one of those who believes that in 2014, sanctions did have an effect in deterring the further destabilization of Ukraine. But of course, there's a big debate about that. But I just wonder if I may ask you a question now. Do you think the economic deterrent has had an effect on this occasion? We seem to be entering a slightly different phase of this crisis after the Scholz visit yesterday, although it's not immediately clear that Russia is withdrawing forces from the border, but it sort of feels as though we have a bit more diplomatic road than we had just a couple of days ago.
I think it's slightly premature to allocate all of this credit to sanctions that they have worked right now, because as you said, Russia's de-escalation, so-called de-escalation, still needs to be verified, still need to have hard evidence whether it's actually happening or whether more troops are gathered on the Belarusian border. But in the long term, Russia will use the Ukraine crisis as this lever. So the sanctions will be still there, but for the moment, I would be cautious to allocate full credit to sanctions threats even.
Thank you. I wonder if we could turn to Tim Ash. Tim, you put out one of your mailings this morning indicating that markets were suddenly feeling quite optimistic again, that we'd entered this so-called phase of de-escalation and everything's going to be okay. How do you read things?
Well, markets always typically want to see things through a rose-tinted spectacles and want a buying opportunity. I think that I agree it's a bit premature. I mean, my view is this, we're far from a conclusion to this crisis, and obviously maybe we'll talk a bit later, but now it's all centered on Minsk 2. But in terms of the sanctions story, maybe my kind of own comments, maybe set the stage a bit. And for me, it's quite striking that, this Biden administration didn't want confrontation with Russia, right? A lot's been made about the intelligence and about it's not credible, and references to the second Gulf War, basically, right? But this administration had no reason for a confrontation with Russia. And I think what's interesting and related to the sanctions story is, I think we've seen a sea change in the Biden administration. I mean, all the focus was on China, right? I mean, there was a desire to kind of box Putin off and Russia off and not think about it and pivot to China. We had the Geneva summit, Biden and Putin. But I think there's a dawning realization with the military buildup about Ukraine that actually Russia is the more immediate and primary threat. Russia is a hegemonic kind of long-term challenger, but Russia is trying to undermine and attack our very systems, Western liberal market democracy and all that thing. And I think there's concern in Washington that if the Biden administration doesn't stand up with Russia on Ukraine, it's a green light, obviously, to Xi with Taiwan, right? So China is important, but actually, Biden and the US administration and the West showing a very strong line on Ukraine and pushing back Russia is really important. And I think we've seen and that's reflected in, I think, a much greater willingness of the Biden administration to hit Russia hard with sanctions, much harder, I think, than we've seen anything before. Reference was previously made to 2014. The other thing that comes out is kind of signaling. And again, this idea that this administration has been really willing to reveal the intelligence. We've never seen that before. I think they learned from the Obama administration mistakes in 2014. And the signaling is important. It's important, I think, for getting allies behind the policy of sanctions, of making allies realize that this is really important. It's a key moment in terms of NATO's future and the Western alliance, obviously, for Ukraine. And we need to be united, and we need to put together a very credible and pretty tough sanctions response to push Putin back. So signaling is for Western allies, but interestingly, I think it's also for Putin himself, right? I mean, I think US officials have been very clear, I think. There's been lots of briefings to media, off record, to the market, actually, also about what is actually going to happen. And I think, there's skepticism about, if the bullets begin to fly, whether the focus will then be on diplomacy and there'll be a reluctance to actually roll out this harsh sanction package. I think that's not the case. I mean, I think actually, if Russia goes in, if Putin goes in, I think this administration will be very eager to show to Russia and to China that it's serious and there are very serious economic consequences. The other point is, I mean, this idea of and actually, remember, we have a very fine-oiled sanctions regime. The officials who are looking to put the sanctions package together, were there in 2014. Most of them, people have been brought back into the administration to help them put things together. We have a very well-oiled kind of set of gears. I would say, the sanctions as is was something like 2 out of 10. If you think Iran is 10, we're kind of 2 to 3. I think the US officials have made it pretty clear that they won't go incrementally, moderately. It won't go to kind of 3 or 3.5. We're likely to go to something like 6 or 7. It's going to be a big hit. It will be painful on Russia. And I think that one of the takeouts, actually, interestingly, from the Biden speech yesterday, I mean, I think there's recognition that, to be able to impact Russia, you have to be willing to bear some of the cost. I mean, this has been one of the big problems of the sanctions that have been rolled out so far, and why we're only 2 or 3 out of 10. And there's a big debate about whether sanctions work. And one of the reasons they haven't been as effective as they could have done is that there's been this real desire not to hurt Western business, Western interests. And there's also been a desire not to really massively impact the Russian economy. US officials have been always eager to say, it's not about crashing the Russian economy. It's not about hurting the Russian population. One of the reasons why one of the big state-owned banks was not sanctioned aggressively, because they didn't want to hurt the ordinary Russian population. It's different this time. I think the very clear-cut message from US officials is, we need to hit Russia. We need to show China that we're serious. If there's going to be pain on Russia and Russian markets, fine. If there's going to be impact backdraft into energy markets, for example, again, we have to bear some of this cost, because this is really important, right? So I think that's kind of interesting. Maria's already mentioned on this idea of how impactful the sanctions have been so far. I referenced the fact that we've had a relatively moderate sanctions package so far. I would counter the view that they haven't been impactful. There was an IMF report recently that suggested that the overall impact was something like less than 0.5% of GDP on the Russian economy, right? That's the direct impact. I'd look at the indirect impact, and Maria's already mentioned Fortress Russia. From a macro perspective, Russia, with such a great balance sheet, 630 billion in FX reserves, public sector debt, less than 20% of GDP, external debt, something like 30% of GDP, but with a growth problem. Actually, in this period since 2014, Russia should have been running a pro-growth, looser fiscal, looser monetary, and actually policy has been uber orthodox and overly aggressive because Putin was building this Fortress Russia policy. So we've had actually economic stagnation, low growth. Putin's not been taking risks in terms of structural reform because he's worried about domestic politics and shaking things up too aggressively. So actually, Russia should be growing at a much more rapid pace, and I would put significant parts of that to geopolitics and sanctions. right? So I disagree with the IMF. I think their assessment of the cost of sanctions is way too low. And as is already mentioned, I think, you know, sanctions are just one part of the decision set, right? It's another bit of pain that Putin will have to suffer if he decides, you know, to go into Ukraine. Just adding already that's been mentioned, just going through some of the sanctions options, there's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit there. Sanctioning secondary trading of new Russian sovereign debt. Obviously, primary's been done. You can still trade secondary new issues. So I guess secondary sanctions on new issues. So any new debt that's issued, institutional investors can't participate in the primary market, and they can't then buy it in the secondary and hold it, right? It could also be the case that they could secondary sanction existing holdings. That's a real possibility. That would lead, there would be periods where existing holders can sell out of positions. But I think already in terms of sovereign debt and institutional investment in Russia, US officials have been briefing the market, have been briefing US banks. I'd imagine they'd be briefing US buy-side guys saying, what the hell are you investing in Russia for? This is a malign actor trying to undermine our system. So there's a general message that, you know, you want to call it ESG, you want to call it whatever you want to call it, but there's a desire for Western investors to reduce their positioning in Russian debt and equities. Nord Stream 2, I think, is gone if Russia goes in. I think SWIFT is unlikely, as I mentioned by Maria. I think full blocking sanctions on Russian state-owned banks is very likely in the first iteration. I think there's a feeling within the US government circles that essentially SWIFT is overrated. You can have a bigger impact by, you know, being very specific in terms of the institutions you sanction, but also likely, you know, sanctioning, for example, very specific ruble transactions. Also, I think Maria's already mentioned what's interesting this time, this willingness of the US to scale up sanctions very significantly. The energy sector is no longer untouchable. There is a real willingness to sanction significant Russian energy enterprises. Again, we can take that message from Biden's speech yesterday. The other significant move is using the US foreign direct product rule to sanction high-tech exports to Russia. Again, very impactful longer term, particularly in terms of Russian defense and high-tech industries, very damaging in terms of Russian longer-term growth. And then oligarch designations. I'm not sure Maria mentioned that already, but we've obviously got the Forbes list. It kind of fits in with the counter kleptocracy agenda that the US Treasury has kind of taken up with. So I would think it's very likely that we'll see some of those big names that are pushed around in the media end up on sanctions list if Russia actually goes in. I think I'll end there. I've probably spoken too much already. Cheers.
So thanks very much. I think you make an intriguing point there about the extent to which sanctions may have, after 2014, may have constrained growth in Russia. And, you know, I asked myself the question, if, you know, this mother of all sanctions package were to be implemented, what would actually be the effect on the Russian economy?
Well, I mean, it's not good. I mean, essentially, it continues the stagnation. It will impact on Russian living standards. It will impact on Putin's political appeal, undoubtedly. I mean, I'm not sure you can believe Russian opinion polls very much, and they all show that Putin is still very popular. But Russians are not particularly happy with their lot in life, right? They don't think the economy is doing particularly well. Governance is pretty poor. Lots of Russians are leaving, young, educated Russians are leaving. And that's because there is no real, there's not much foreign direct investment coming into the country. And you know, this will just continue Russia's kind of decay. And it almost reminds one a bit of, you know, Russia's failed intervention in Afghanistan in the late 70s. And then we had the period of the 80s where, you know, the Russian economy really wasn't going anywhere. And then we ended up in the collapse a decade later. Again, sanctions are not going to crash the Russian economy. They're not going to force Putin out. They're not going to cause mass social unrest now. But I think they will add to the general population's unease about the direction of travel in terms of Russia, and they will make life more difficult. And I think you could possibly highlight, what happened in Kazakhstan recently. I mean, no one expected the level of social unrest in Kazakhstan, and we kind of all know it wasn't really an elite plot. It was basically ordinary people pretty upset with their ordinary lives, and I think many Russians have the same kind of feelings.
Okay, thank you. Certainly in Kazakhstan, that's tension was simmering under the surface. So it was going to come to the fore at some point. You may well be right about Russia as well. There's similar resentments are there. Can we turn to Steve Mann, please? Steve, you are still with us, I see. Very good. You've been in Washington, I understand, in recent weeks, and I'm sure in dialogue with the think tank community and some of your former colleagues. How do you assess things?
Well, indeed, and sanctions are as much talked about around the table as they are in the headlines. The key, I think, in this crisis and in general is not to ask of sanctions more than sanctions can do. And I mean, John, as you and the others know, sanctions have been so much discussed and used, especially in Washington in recent years. And there are reasons for this. In the US, especially, sanctions are quick to impose. You do it with the stroke of a pen, with a presidential executive order. They're high profile. You can show your voters. You can show Congress that you're on the case. They're bloodless, which is another attraction in this Instagram age. And an important thing, I think, for any Western government, the sanctions shift the cost of action from the public sector to the private sector. So looking back at the history of sanctions with Moscow, I have my own favorite of sanctions that have been effective. And what I'd put on the table are the COCOM sanctions, the trade restrictions on the Soviet Union for decades over the Cold War. And the key point on this is the COCOM sanctions had the wide buy-in from all the economies that mattered back then. And they were tight, they were well crafted, they made the Soviet military less powerful, clearly, and they burdened the Soviet economy. But then when you go to the current day, in a globalized era, sanctions are much chancier. And my case in point here are the energy sanctions that the West put on Russia after the 2014 invasion. I was in the State Department talking to a senior official back in 2014, and he said, Russia's a petrostate. That's why we have to target oil. So sanctions were put on new oil development, but these sanctions didn't get a wider buy-in of all the major economies. You didn't have Japan, India joining these sanctions, not to mention China. So you have a difference there in trying to apply these economic sanctions. And then we heard back in 2014 these very frequent pledges that there will be no daylight between the US and Europe on the energy sanctions. Well, as it turned out, there was a considerable amount of daylight in the design and the implementation of the oil sanctions. So a few years after the sanctions came into effect, we saw the Italian oil company, Eni, drilling for oil in the Russian Black Sea and using Saipem's Scarabeo 9 sanctions buster rig to do it. So the net effect of these sanctions is that Russia hit a record oil production level of 11.25 million barrels per day. And I will argue that certainly on energy sanctions, that effect was more symbolic than telling. And Washington's hope in this was that the sanctions which were later tightened by the US Congress. And an aside here, I think Congress writing sanctions into law is a bad idea for reasons we can go into later. So the hope was that these sanctions and tightened sanctions would have that effect. I part company with Tim. I like that. I think the IMF's assessment that the net effect of sanctions was a 0.2 cut in GDP. I think that is a very telling statistic. And you look at the Russian economy in those years, it was oil price that put the real burden on the Russian economy, far more than sanctions. And if you had to rerun it, if you said back in 2014, if the policymakers knew that we would come out of these energy sanctions with nil effect on Russian GDP and record Russian oil production, you have to say, how sanguine would we be about imposing them? So this is not to argue against sanctions. I think they're going to be essential in this situation. I mean, they've served a deterrent effect already, I hope, but they have to be well crafted. So sanctions are a necessary part of statecraft, but not a sufficient part. And if Russia unwisely launches a new invasion, whether that's something full scale or whether it's bites of Ukrainian territory, I hope this results in very tough sanctions. I like Peter Harrell's formulation, which is start high, stay high. And the first target has to be the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That in the event of new Russian aggression, that this pipeline just becomes steel in the ground instead of a functioning throughput for Russian gas. Beyond that, new extractive sanctions are going to be hard to implement because of the backfill problem of other countries and companies that can go in and take that place in the Russian extractive sector. What I would argue for are, going hard at the beginning on the financial sector, retail banks, state banks, and there Washington and London especially have disproportionate influence. And finally, a final point, sort of regardless of the current Ukraine picture, it's a signal to the West to get more serious about financial transparency. And this certainly goes for the United States, as well as Britain and the European Union. And also look again at immigration. Closed schemes like Malta's golden passport scheme. And have a look also at visa sanctions that will bar Russian oligarchs, officials, and their families from enjoying the West while profiting from a system that's hostile to the West. So in sum, that's sort of a, introduction to how I'm viewing the issue.
Steve, thanks very much. Lots of wise words there. I like the example you used of COCOM and how the world was a different place at that stage, and the type of impact you could achieve, which has clearly not been visible in, I suppose, recent times with the sanctions after 2014. I've also thought that we have this view of sanctions as being some sort of sharp instrument, but in actual fact, it's quite a blunt instrument that may produce a result over time. And as a former US diplomat said to me a while back, sanctions are what you do when you can't think of doing anything better. And it sort of does feel a little bit like that. But in terms of, particularly looking at the industry you know well, the oil and gas industry, if this latest package of sanctions were to be implemented, do you think there is going to be some sort of major impact on the Russian oil and gas industry?
Well, I don't know what it would look like. In 2014, for example, US officials were very good about reaching out to industry and saying, what about this? What about that? One of the things that was on the table was making Rosneft an SDN. And we said, okay, congratulations.
What is an SDN for our?
Sorry, was a specially designated entity. So you can't, it becomes radioactive. You can't engage with it. And we said, congratulations, you've just shut off Kazakhstan's oil supply to world markets, because Rosneft is a shareholder in the CPC pipeline, which exports Kazakhstan's oil. And then Western companies could not participate in it. You also have BP owning 20% of Rosneft. What happens to BP shares, end. If you sanction individual projects, so for example, let's say you make it impossible for ExxonMobil to continue to operate Sakhalin-1 oil project. What you've done then is you have just given a massive wealth transfer to the Kremlin, because the foreign company is out of compliance with its contracts. And it's not that the oil and the gas won't be produced. What it means is that Russia will take over the production. And final footnote, more than 95% of Russian oil is produced by Russian companies, not foreign companies. So that makes it a much chancier proposition to target.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers for being extremely disciplined. And again, this is the point where we have just over 50 minutes of discussion. So I'd like to open the floor, and we have, I see 88 participants, so that includes, of course, the speakers. So we have over 80 people attending this session. So I am happy to take questions. So please, if you want to put up your electronic hand, I will endeavor to see it. Do we have anybody who wants to take the floor with a question immediately? We have a question to Tim that came from Mary Dejevsky. I don't know if you've seen this on chat. You spoke about a new will. Sorry, it just disappeared from my screen. You spoke about a new will to sanction the energy sector, including from the US. Is the UK equally enthusiastic?
I think it is. I mean, the travails of Boris Johnson notwithstanding, I don't know. I think there's a general recognition in Europe, in the West, that Russia is a revanchist power, a malign actor, that his stance on Ukraine is kind of a bit of a game changer, and we've become over reliant, obviously, on Russia energy. It's proven this winter that it's not a reliable partner, not a reliable supplier, and I think whether Putin escalates from here or not, I mean, I think he will lose because of what's happened this winter, because I think Europe will move to diversify away from Russian energy. Now, that's not going to be an overnight, clearly. We're too dependent on Russian gas and oil. But I think over the medium term, that's certainly going to happen. And I've argued in sort of written work I've put out there that maybe one reason that Putin, has been so aggressive this winter with Ukraine is that the carbon transition, and his assumption that energy transition happens anyway, and Russia's leverage in the energy sector is kind of now or never. Clearly we're vulnerable. We want to do as much as we can to support Ukraine. Sanctions are one of the angles, but as I mentioned earlier, we've got to be prepared to take some pain. If this is important, if we value Western liberal market democracy, we value our way of life, rule of law, all that kind of gig. If we value that, then I think we have to be prepared to take some pain, and the energy sector is obviously one of them. Actually, one further point there. I mean, it's interesting if you look at the opinion polls out of the US. and also Europe. I mean, there does seem to be a shift to recognizing Russia as the aggressor, and that Ukraine is a project, is a country that we actually should support, right? I mean, that's quite remarkable, particularly in the US, when you think post-Trump or through Trump, that, you know, Americans weren't particularly interested in foreign adventures, but actually this is one foreign adventure that Americans seem to think is important, right?
Correct. Tim, thank you for that. I mean, my one comment about when you say now or never, you know, in Putin's mind about the value of, you know, gas exports, it would seem to me that Russia's probably got at least you know, a couple of decades still as being a major gas exporter to Europe. So quite a lot of time to play with. Just for, continuing on the energy theme, we have a question from Katia Yafimova, who asks if Nord Stream 2 were to be halted in the event of invasion and the Ukrainian corridor, so gas transit corridor, were to become unavailable, European gas security would be in, as she puts it, dire straits. There's no realistic alternative available. So what is the plan B? Steve, would you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing the answer to that unfold with the increase in LNG shipments, particularly from the US. This 50% of American LNG shipments are now going to Europe, not, I hasten to add, because of political will, but because of price signals. So we see that. We see Germany, for example, burning more coal to generate electricity. The workarounds are in progress and the warm weather is coming. So I think Europe is patching its way through this situation. One of the things that's striking here are Putin's unintended consequences. So with the saber rattling, he's managed to revitalize NATO, galvanize Ukrainian nationalism, and also start Europe more firmly on the path towards alternative gas supplies, principally LNG.
Steve, thank you. We have a question, just to finish on the energy theme for a moment, from Yannick Lasotsky about the new German government's position on Nord Stream 2. And Yannick asks, why are the speakers optimistic it would be suspended or stopped? So who would like to take that?
John, I'm almost willing to jump in there and say you should answer that question.
No,
as probably the leading expert on Russian-German relations, having written a book on it.
I thought I might leave it to others to answer, but does anybody on the panel have a view on that? I'm happy to offer my own, but anybody else like to
jump in?
Go on, Maria, please. Yeah.
I'm not optimistic, so I don't share that it will be stopped, because we saw quite a lot of divisions within the first time three-party government. Each party has very different position of it. It didn't manage to coalesce some coherent policy on this, and we still hear very different opinions what German government will be prepared to do. But most importantly, we don't hear Chancellor Scholz actually saying it out loud that this will be stopped, and this is quite disconcerting, because obviously here financial damages are at stake. So Germany is in a difficult situation from investment perspective, but ultimately, if we consider it as not a commercial project, but a geopolitical, geoeconomic project, there should be some readiness to trigger a stop on it. And to refer to Katya's question, the question is, why would the Ukrainian infrastructure not be able to function? This is something that Ukraine was particularly emphasizing, that there is a threat that Russia would undermine the functionality of the Ukrainian infrastructure. But if there are no cyber or other risk for the Ukrainian infrastructure, it's in a pretty good shape. What we saw recently was actually the Russian infrastructure had to go through multiple maintenance works on various routes. So you don't strictly speaking need Nord Stream 2. There is enough spare capacity to supply Europe. The question is why Russia not ready to do it.
Well, let me offer a point there also on Nord Stream 2. Even if Europe doesn't go along with this, the US has unilateral weapons it can turn against Nord Stream 2. One example is target the executives, the officials, the operators, and make them individually as SDNs. So the Biden administration waived the sanctions on Matthias Vornik last May. Well, they can unwaive them and they can apply that against the Western corporate people involved in this. It's a disincentive.
So thank you, Maria and Steve. John Luff's view on this is that if push comes to a shove and if Russia were to invade Ukraine further, then I think it would be politically impossible, in fact, in Germany to pursue Nord Stream 2. I think there would then be an indefinite moratorium. But Maria's absolutely right that Chancellor Scholz has not spelled it out in exactly those words. But I think from his meeting with recent meeting with Biden, it was pretty clear what had been agreed. Moving on, we have a question from Alice Wells. Would you expect retaliatory sanctions from Russia, and if so, in which sectors?
I think there is a wide variety of Russia can do, so the West definitely should be prepared. Where Russia profits from is informality of those measures. So that lends Russia a lot of plausible deniability by basically using proxy actors in terms of cyber attacks. We can expect that, well, yesterday actually Ukrainian banks were under severe cyber attacks again. So the same could be done in the West as well. Energy blackmail is already sort of tacitly happening, again with a plausible deniability that more gas is needed for domestic consumption. Again, easy to brush off and say this is not us and so on. Russia is also conveniently one of the largest supply of critical raw materials as palladium, titanium. Again, another sore point where it can trigger it. Some people are concerned that if Russian banks are placed on the SDN list, Russia can just expropriate property and assets of those foreign subsidiaries. So there are quite few weak points. So I think the point here is the West should be prepared to weather also retaliatory measures as well.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose the big question is to what extent those possible retaliatory measures have been considered and factored into our existing thinking. There's a question from Laura Baldwin. Do any of the panel members have a view on cyber sanctions in particular, perhaps on how these may be used and their potential impact? Steve, is that something you can possibly address? I've often wondered whether the US has given the Russian side a hint of its capabilities in this area and what might happen if. Are there any grounds for that view?
Hopes, but no grounds that I can express, John. I have to plead ignorance on this one.
Okay, all right. Is there anybody else on the panel who could address cyber?
I mean, the EU has a cyber sanctions regime, but the scope of these measures, I would say, quite minimal. It's asset freezes and visa bans. So if they are placed only on those who executed those cyber attacks, let's say marginal figures, the impact will also be marginal. So in terms of cyber, there is a broad discussion how much they can actually shift the behavioral changes of these people. And as I said, in terms of Russia, if it's a proxy actors that can have this distance and shift responsibility, I don't see a lot of impact in this case. I mean, the Biden administration talked to the Kremlin in Geneva and said, you know, we need to agree that these 6 sectors should not be targeted. And they gave 6 months to wait for it. So this is more on negotiation level than really the sanctions that can shift a lot there.
Thank you. We have an intriguing question, and I must say it's just something that was slightly at the back of my mind while I was listening to the opening statements from our speakers. I have an old Russian friend who works at let me put it this way, a state bank, who after 2014 and the introduction of sanctions wrote me a message saying, "Spasibo za sankcje," thank you for the sanctions, on the grounds that these were in fact going to be very good for Russia in certain ways. And of course, one can argue that the Russian agricultural sector has benefited in particular from sanctions. The question we're asked is, a number of Russian analysts have suggested, this is from Robert Otto, a number of Russian analysts have suggested that some around Putin see advantages to sanctions in terms of their domestic agenda. Granted that these people around Putin may be miscalculating, but if these analysts are correct, what does it say about sanctions as a deterrent? Tim, any thoughts there on this sort of counterintuitive side to sanctions?
Yeah, look, I mean, I always have the view that the amount of lobbying and effort that is put from the Russian side in trying to stop sanctions makes me think that they don't particularly like them very much, right? I mean, I think from a reputational image perspective, it doesn't look very good. In my mind, it's increased the cost of capital. I mean, look at what's happening at the moment. There's geopolitical sanctions risk. Russia's borrowing costs have increased. And just on what was said earlier, I mean, again, the IMF assumptions, for my mind, in terms of impact on growth, underestimated the true impact on longer term growth in the Russian economy.
We have a question from Katya Glod, who asks, if Russia doesn't invade Ukraine, will any of the current sanctions be imposed? Or what would be the likely deterrent strategy towards Russia if it continues to destabilize Ukraine? And I think a distinction being drawn here between invasion and destabilization.
I think this is an important question because this gray space between escalation and de-escalation is very easy, would be for the West to say, well, finally, Russia is de-escalating. We don't need this sweeping package of sanctions, and we won't definitely see the full list of sanctions, mother of all sanctions and all nuclear options on the list. And that could mean for the Russian this piecemeal strategy, again, by launching cyber attacks or destabilizing the Ukrainian government, false flag operations, disinformation. Again, the options here are quite broad. And what would likely to be the response from the West, in particular from the EU, is tit-for-tat sanctions. For example, if it's sanctions against cyber attack, if it's cyber attacks, it will be only sanctions against cyber attacks. Again, very minimal impact from this would be expected. Depends on what type of aggression, something less than escalation Russia would want to go for, but my understanding is the main discussion in the EU is that they can't agree on the triggers if it's not an escalation, and this is quite handy in terms of that the whole package will not be triggered.
Thank you. I mean, Steve, if I could push you a little bit on this question, which I find a sort of especially difficult one, this distinction between the threatening with a military instrument and then doing nothing, but in the process managing to destabilize the situation within Ukraine. I mean, how is the US government going to react to that? If it's something that stops short of all-out use of military force, but is in fact something that we might call more hybrid, if I can use that word.
Well, this gets into dilemma territory. So a first point on infrastructure and sanctions. If there is no invasion, then we're back to this situation of Nord Stream 2 moving slowly but gradually towards approval and implementation. And that's, Nord Stream, the US opposition to Nord Stream 2 came in very late in a project. So I think we're going to be still faced with the fate of that pipeline. And it may well happen if Russia backs off. In terms of what the West does with Ukraine, there's been a lot of great work done on reforming Ukraine's wildly corrupt energy sector. So there's been a real transformation there that has to continue. At the end of the day, John, You know, the fate of Ukraine rests on Ukrainians. And the West can support the political transformation, the economic transparency. And we need to do that. And we need to be very robust in military support. But that's the kind of things we need to be doing as when one hopes this crisis passes.
Indeed, thank you, Steve. We're getting back to the Nord Stream 2 issue again. That doesn't leave us, and we have an important question here from Shoichi Ito. Excuse me for any mispronunciation. Many people are talking about imposing sanctions on Nord Stream 2. However, why don't they consider imposing sanctions on Russia's LNG projects in the Arctic, especially when Russia is trying to become an LNG superpower by accelerating the development of capital intensive projects in the Arctic, and China will indeed be the biggest beneficiary on the consumer side. So, anybody have an answer to that question? Why Arctic LNG has not been in the mix? Tim? Or Steve?
Yeah, let me can do that quickly. The LNG has roughly a global price set. It's not like pipeline gas where you have take or pay contracts. So if Russia brings more LNG onto the market, that helps European energy security. It brings the global price of LNG down. LNG cargoes are fungible, and it makes LNG more attractive vis-a-vis pipeline gas.
Tim, any view?
If I can also maybe chip in, nice to hear from you, Shoichi, as well. I think the discussion, from what I heard, didn't reach towards sanctioning anything Arctic onshore, including where many LNG plants are positioned now. But now to go against the existing ones would be very hard, because the international participation in this project is quite broad, and it was potentially intentionally designed so to attract as many international funders, participants as possible, to make it, if you want, sanctions proof, because this is no one will go against, Japanese and Chinese and others, French participants. So that makes it harder to go against as if it was only purely Russian. So I didn't hear any discussion to go against it. The only option that was floated is to sanction Russia's new gas projects. Again, depending on how we define gas or LNG, that would be depending on how the scope of sanctions is drafted.
Okay, very good. I see that my colleague Orysia Lucevich has raised a hand. Orysia, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much, John. Orysia Lucevich, I'm the head of Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. Fascinating panel. Thank you so much. I think we all need to learn more about sanctions, and you are an excellent panel for that. I have a question linked to this invasion on invasion, because Russia has the full spectrum of tools to undermine both Ukraine and Europe. And we've seen just cyber attack recently, but we also see the blockade in the Azov and Black Sea. We see the motion, for example, to recognize independence of LNR, DNR. France said that it would be considered an attack on Ukraine's sovereignty. So taking into account this toolbox that Russia has, are we also thinking in terms of sanctions as a scale, right? If there is a scale of escalation, is there a scale of sanctions? Similar to what Maria said, that cyber is linked to that kind of sanctions. What kind of sanctions would be linked if Russia recognizes LNR, DNR, right? If it moves its own peacekeepers into the region that it already occupies. So this is one question. And maybe, is there any difference between US and European approach to that, or not much? And also, I want to bring in China. How much is China helping Russia to cushion the effect of sanctions, the Western sanctions help on Russia? How significant is that? And do we see any Russian evolution in the strategy to rely more on China? Thank you so much.
Who would like to have a go at those questions?
I think it's an important question how the West is prepared, and I would push to go further, not to rely solely on sanctions, because sanctions is not a magic bullet. And as I said, some of sanctions options are very limited what they can achieve. So the expectations should also be quite constrained, because then it's very easy to brush off, they don't work, and move on. What needs to be expanded is the West economic statecraft, because there are much more tools in this toolbox, and we only see sometimes routine sanctions on not very important people, and again, don't see much impact. So this toolbox can be expanded in terms of expert control, something that was also now floated as one of the potential option if Russia invades. You also have foreign investment screening mechanisms and also robust anti-money laundering regulation, something that Stephen mentioned, to make the West more resilient from within, and that makes you free to retaliate as well, because you're not afraid of domestic vulnerabilities. In terms of China, I did cover it in my presentation, so I just maybe briefly recap it. What we learned from 2014, that China is ready to capitalize on Russia's isolation, but this capitalization comes at a higher cost in terms of lending, in terms of providing technology. China is very reluctant to provide any technology transfers, unlike the Western companies. So it uses Russia as a testing ground, but also to up its own technology. Now we see Chinese offshore platforms in the Kara Sea and so on, and that makes Russia more reliant on China. But Russia is realizing that as well. So the recent strategy is to diversify to India as this new partner. Before it was Japan. With the new government in Japan, it doesn't work this way. Today we heard that Japan is ready to actually draft a new package of sanctions against Russia, something that the previous government wasn't as ready to do so. So Russia is also not placing everything in one box and trying to diversify the risks.
Maybe I just add on the China thing that if you remember back, I can't remember the date now, but after the first imposition of sanctions, when Russia tried, promoting the East Siberian gas pipeline, right? I mean, the Chinese negotiated a superb deal in terms of pricing. I mean, they did the Russians no favors whatsoever. I mean, they exploited Russian weakness at the time, and I seem to remember even they didn't even provide the financing for the pipeline itself. And we know about the rivalries between Russia and China. They're kind of uncomfortable partners forced together, obviously, because of Russia's agenda, obviously, with Ukraine, and China's difficulty with post-Trump, I guess.
Thank you, Tim. I was quite struck by some Russian commentary about Putin's recent visit to Beijing, where it seemed that, according at least to the analysis I saw, that he didn't receive the red carpet treatment from the Chinese side at all, and was made to feel that he was very much the junior partner, and possibly didn't come away from that visit sort of feeling it was particularly satisfactory. But sort of no surprises, and I think Tim points to the fact that the Chinese side really did exploit sort of Russia's hour of need back in 2014. I mean, given those gas negotiations had been going on for so long, they could have got a much better price earlier on. Steve, I wanted to ask you just about the sort of gradations of sanctions, the question that Alicia started with. When President Biden, how shall I put it, misspoke and referred to an incursion as distinct from an invasion, I sort of did wonder whether that was something that had it was in his head because he'd sort of been briefed on the issue. Do we look at sort of gradations of sanctions? Do you think that is a possibility? That
I think it. Oh, sorry, John.
Yeah, that we would end up in a situation where if something, let's put it crudely, that if Russians didn't march to Kiev but instead lopped off a tiny piece of Donbass, that there would be a different reaction.
This leads to a much wider point. I think I'll speak for American policymakers, that American policymakers are subject to mirror imaging. in the way that we interpret potential reactions in the way that we might interpret reactions. That is going for slicing the salami finely and doing fine gradations of escalation in the belief that the other side will get it. I'm not sure that's really the case with Russia. I'm not sure that subtlety in a sanctions gradation is going to work. And if Russia took some of the measures, like we're talking about recognizing the Donetsk and Luhansk, doing other type, infiltrating its soldiers on a permanent basis, I argue for going hard at the beginning. We have no illusions about what Russia's desired end game is. And I think we run the risk with lesser sanctions of getting in a 2014-like situation where we think they're going to be impactful in Moscow, and they turn out really not to be. So I argue for a statement at the beginning. This is not to say by any means that the West throws everything at first go. There are gradations as to how many banks you might sanction, whether sovereign debt gets further included in that. There's SWIFT at the end of the fork. There are individual SDN designations, but in whichever combination the West adopts, I hope we are not overly modest, even against what might seem like a modest provocation.
Understood. And just to finish on this theme, a question perhaps to Tim and or Maria. It's one that fascinates me. We've seen in recent days a couple of retired military officers, one of whom is sort of particularly well networked in the veteran circles, saying that a military intervention in Ukraine, a full-scale invasion, would be a disaster for Russia. And some of us initially thought that when General Ivashov made this statement that it was some sort of fake that had been put out there by the Ukrainian side, because it just seems so uncharacteristic, at least to those of us who have met the gentleman concerned and spoken with him. But have any Russian economic policymakers in any form or those close to them said anything about the effect of this scale of sanctions?
I just read banks reports, sell-side banks reports, and I guess the overwhelming message is this idea of fortress Russia. Russia can withstand almost anything. It's not going to hurt Russia particularly. It's not particularly a constraint on the scale of Russia's sort of military intervention in the end.
Maria, have you spotted anything?
No, absolutely. I think recently Russian banks and companies, energy companies, have been doing a lot of stress tests to be resilient in case of various options, whether it's SDN or expert controls. And there was an interesting reporting that obviously nothing bad penetrates the media, but behind the facade, they all worried that there is not enough, high quality software that can replace Western programs. So the import substitution again on this front has not been successful. So this will be a sore point. Microchips, semiconductors, again, this is another sore point. So it's hard to, really capture this wariness, if you want, because on the surface they need to portray compliance with all the orders coming from above, and it's only some anecdotal evidence that suggests that the worry is there, and the main worry might not come from sanctions as such, but it's the reduction of trust from the West, from Western investors, that it aggravates the already adverse business climate, and this will be this indirect cost of sanctions, as Tim was mentioning before.
Yeah,
maybe I can just add there on it, and I've also written about it. And it's quite interesting that investors get their views on Russia from banks. right, from international banks, from Russian banks, US banks, whatever. And the Russian banks don't really want to talk about geopolitics very much, right? And obviously not about sanctions, right? I don't know why that is. Maybe, you know, obviously they're reluctant. Maybe they're liberal leaning, and the actual analysts, and they don't want to annoy the Kremlin. And the US banks also don't want to talk about it, which is quite extraordinary. And you know, my own discussions with various analysts are that compliance departments typically don't want to get into this space, right? They don't want to annoy governments by saying something potentially controversial. Compliance departments are terrified of analysts talking about sanctions. So generally, investors, you know, it's very binary. I mean, the analyst community just or analyst community just talk about Russia's great balance sheet and the ruble's really cheap, and the macro suggests the ruble should be appreciating massively, and then they kind of leave out all the geopolitical risk, which is actually the geopolitical risks and sanctions risk are actually what's driving Russian markets and Russian performance in the last sort of 6 months or so, and actually you could say since 2014.
Understood. Tim, thank you. We have a question from James Nixie from Chatham House. James, please.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. A really fantastic panel. I really appreciate it. Yes, along with my colleague Arisia, we're trying to encourage people to sort of speak out and give a chair a hand, perhaps, but maybe failing. Anyway, my question is on the targeting oligarchs point that I think Tim came to at the end of his initial remarks. And I just never really understood why we've been so reticent about it. I mean, why wouldn't we? I mean, is it because we're afraid of a legal challenge and we'd lose it and look bad? Is it because of lobbying and they've got friends in high places, which we kind of know that they do? Is it the retaliation point? It just seems to me that it would be a popular move at home. It would probably be fairly popular in Russia as well. It wouldn't affect ordinary Russians to the same extent. And they're basically criminals anyway. So I just have never understood why what's holding us, what's stopping us.
Well, maybe I can jump in there. And James, you remember almost a year to the day, we had a session at Chatham House about the London laundromat, which I spoke, and actually I redistributed my speaker's notes from that time. And like you, it's beyond me. You know, it's beyond me why the UK government hasn't done more. And obviously there are suspicions of you know, that oligarchs are very influential, and obviously they've spread a lot of money around the City of London, and there's a lot of lobbying not to do that. But again, I find it absolutely extraordinary, right? You know, Catherine Belton's book is a great expose. I think I probably need to be a little bit careful what I say about that, given the recent legal case. But yeah, I don't understand it, and London's not doing enough. The reality is KYC rules. You know, the existing rules for banks should be enough, actually, for banks to already clamp down on suspect Russian money, in my mind. But it's maybe compliance departments aren't rigorous enough. Maybe regulators don't give a strong enough lead to banks about you know, large oligarchs from former Soviet space and elsewhere. Actually, I mean, it's not just a former Soviet problem, right? It's a global problem about, you know, big business in London.
Let me add in to second and third all of this. What happened to the unexplained wealth orders? I mean, that came in a few years ago. I think they've used them twice against some Azerbaijani couple that fell out with Baku. So it seems like there's, you know, I agree with the panelists, there's huge upside on all of this. Part of it is, I think that in these austerity years, government is not funding the legal sector. It's cut criminal justice. It's funding things that the public cares about, like the NHS, social care, things like that. And then there's, I saw Janet's great observation in chat. Well, oligarchs are donating to the Conservative Party. So in this, as in everything else, it's multifactorial.
Steve, thank you. It does remind me of a lesson I was taught in my early years as a British civil servant, when somebody said to me, don't put down to suspect motives what can be reliably attributed to incompetence. And I think there is a degree of that here. And the points made about, the resourcing of the National Crime Agency, the Serious Fraud Office, and how many Russian speakers we have in the Serious Fraud Office, I would be very interested to know. I even volunteered my services a while back to the National Crime Agency, and I received a very polite email saying they would be in touch, and I never heard from them again. So there we go.
Can I add maybe a couple of points, if I may?
Go on, please.
I think it's important to also, well, 2 points. First, sanctions would be a quick tool to slap restrictions on these people, but we need to go back to the beginning, that it's about robust anti-money laundering regulations in general. The UK's recent move to say that they will impose sanctions on every oligarch close to the Kremlin should not be linked to Russia's invasion in Ukraine as a rule as such. And then I think in terms of jurisdictions, US, UK, and the EU have very different requirements to trigger it. Obviously, in the US, it's much easier to do. There are various packages which can be triggered. It can be only like with Kolomoisky, for example, it was only on him and not on his extended family members, so that there are various instruments. In the UK, it has been proposed recently, and there are also better legal evidence standards in terms of withstanding the judicial review at the EU level. It's quite hard to do. First of all, there is no instrument as such that can target corruption, so this is something that EU opted not to include in the Magnitsky-like legislation. So there are just various, opportunities that can be done in those jurisdictions and what can be expected. But I agree that the UK and the US would be the leading, and that would be an option with little blowback if we care about the collateral damage as such. So it's quite surprising that this sanctions option is not very discussed in general.
Maria, thank you. I was waiting for the question on SWIFT, and I'm grateful to Natin Satsvadze for asking that question. The question is, can the panel address how SWIFT, if considered, would be done? As a term I don't personally understand here, blacklining. Should blacklining be done prior to invoking SWIFT, or will this not be needed? Perhaps somebody can enlighten us on the notion of blacklining. Tim, can you speak on SWIFT?
Yeah, I don't know much about blacklining. I'm not a particular expert on SWIFT. I think in general, the Russians made it clear. That comment that sanctioning SWIFT would be, in effect declaring war, I think pushed Western governments back from going down that route. And I guess, the assumption was it was a kind of a shotgun kind of approach, and actually a much more targeted approach than going down the SWIFT route would be far more effective. Hence, full blocking sanctions on Russian state-owned banks, or looking at particular transactions, like ruble clearing of particular deals, I guess. So, I think the consent, SWIFT is very sexy, and the newspaper, it's in the headlines all the time, but my sense is that there are more effective ways to make an impact than with a blunderbuss, or whatever you want to call it, of going down the SWIFT route.
Okay, we just had an important clarification from Annette Bourne. Annette, thank you for this, because I should have thought of it. She says, I think it's a typo, she means blacklisting. Yeah, Maria, go on.
Yeah, sorry. Since I wrote an article on SWIFT and is cut off, I think it's just a few points. I think it is branded as the nuclear option, but I agree with Tim that there are much more hard-hitting options here. But we need to distinguish between short-term effects and long-term effects. In the short term, it will be, if you like, nuclear effects, because you need to find quickly a substitute. The problem is Russia has its own alternatives to SWIFT, but it doesn't have the network effect and, more importantly, trust of other international financial institutions. So short term, you can expect more capital outflows, more currency volatility, and all negative effects that come in from that. In the long term, the question goes back to this interdependence, or Russia's interconnectedness. because it's so connected to energy markets, the question how the West will pay for all of this. And that's not just Germany paying for Russian gas, but it's also the US paying for Russian oil. There are other options. Could be substituted with less secure, slower options. But overall, I think we should be also aware of unintended consequences long-term. Let's say if Russia conditions the export of its hydrocarbons on the use of its own system, which could potentially undermine the dominance of SWIFT in the very long-term perspective.
Thank you, Maria. Steve, any observations on your side on the SWIFT issue?
No, I cannot improve on the answers.
That's a very good answer in itself. But maybe Steve, to get back to your area of specialization, colleague Robert Brinkley makes the very fair point that he says that Nord Stream 2 is a bad idea in itself, that has little support in Europe, and he says surely it should not be reprieved even if Russia does not launch further military action against Ukraine. Is this issue in Washington going to continue to be out there?
I think yes, because long before these hostilities, Nord Stream 2, opposition to Nord Stream 2 became a touch point, a surrogate marker for opposition to Putin. So it's taken on that symbolic effect in Washington. Now, I mean, that said, is it a bad idea? When Russia builds pipelines, you have to look not merely at the commercial calculations like we would, but there's also personal profit in it for the oligarchs building it. And certainly a point in this has been to cut out Ukraine. In terms of European energy security, I don't think Nord Stream 2 is a fundamental issue. What it really is it's an issue for Ukraine. It deprives Ukraine of transit revenue in the first instance. I mean, that's what it's about. And I think if and when Nord Stream 2 goes ahead, if there is no Russian, move against Ukraine, then what the West needs to do is look at how it backfills that revenue that Ukraine would be losing. So again, it is a dilemma because it was on track for approval before these hostilities. And then there are a lot of Europeans who do want this pipeline to go ahead.
But equally, there are several European countries that don't want it to go ahead. So there's quite a division on the issue. But I'm sure that we're going to continue to debate its merits for a good long while yet. We're sort of drawing to a conclusion because it's 25 past the hour. I want to thank our excellent panel for their contributions and ask, are there any final words they'd like to say? Maria, perhaps we could start with you. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I think on the long-term perspective, it's important to understand how resilient and how willing the West will be in the future in terms of the Ukraine crisis is here to stay. That means Russia's saber rattling will be here maybe in a year if, let's say, this is de-escalation. That leaves a question, what sanctions or what other instruments are here on the table? And that comes with the willingness of the West to pay higher price or use any other strategy that could be available. And I'm just thinking whether we are running out of these nuclear sanctions options or any hard-hitting sanctions options that can be used in the future. So basically how to solve all of this is not an easy feat to do, but we need to think long-term as well.
Thank you. Tim?
When people ask me about sanctions and Russia and what's the future, I mean, I always highlight the direction of travel in Russian-Western relationships, and you could go back to Putin's Munich Security Council speech, Georgia, etc. I mean, the direction of travel in the relationship continues to be towards deterioration, right? I mean, and the latest crisis around Ukraine is just part and parcel of that. So I think we are going to get more sanctions around Russia. I mean, again, it's one of the few options the West has. It'll be interesting this time around if things do happen, whether we do go from a 2 to 3 to a 6 to 7 and what impact. And actually, latterly, we did talk about it in the breakout room before. I mean, if this really is de-escalation, are the sanctions critics going to accept that sanctions played a part in de-escalation this time around? I mean, could this actually be a sanctions win?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. Steve, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll end where I began with the words of "Don't ask of sanctions more than sanctions can do." So they're essential in this crisis, but not sufficient. There are real military decisions and concepts we have to come to grips with. We have to take care of, put our own house in order with financial transparency, with the hospitality we offer to immigrating oligarchs. But I think there's a wider point, and I'll conclude with this, John, that we need to take a step back and look at the wider Russian challenge to the West, which I think is not fundamentally geographic. It's a global challenge involving Russia's cyber aggression, cybersecurity issues, and the overall erosion of the Western system of rule of law that is inimical to Putin and the Kremlin. And we need to take the step back and look at how globally we are going to counter that.
Steve, thank you. You make an important point there that sanctions are a tool of policy. They're not a policy for dealing with Russia on their own, just as dialogue is a tool of policy and not a policy on its own. So I'm going to stop on that note. Thank you so much, Maria, Tim and Steve, for joining this panel today. It's been a really great discussion. Thank you very much.